Retired Marine Colonel Mark Cancian is a senior advisor with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, joining us this morning. Thank you for being here, Mark.
Thank you for having me on the show.
So this is a very fluid situation, developments coming in by the minute. Most recently, we've heard that out of the Kremlin that Russia is willing to talk with Ukraine. They would meet in Belarus. What do you make of that 2 days into this invasion?
I think the war is not going very well for Ukraine. They mobilized late. The Russians have struck hard. Their column from Belarus heading south to the capital, Kyiv, seems to be making good progress. They're on the outskirts of the city. So I think that the Ukrainians are interested in trying to make a deal. The deal looks like it would be something about neutrality, not making a commitment not to join NATO. That would be a substantial concession on their part, because up until the war began, they were adamant that they wanted to join NATO. In fact, it's in their constitution that they are going to try to join NATO in the EU. So this would be a substantial step back for them, but given the military situation, they may not have a choice. Let me add one thing, though. In your introduction, you said the United States was sending troops to Ukraine. No, we're sending troops to Eastern Europe. They are not going to Ukraine.
Thank you for that correction. I do want to ask, though, for Ukrainians, you mentioned that would be a significant step back, but one thing they do want to retain is their freedom. There's been talks about Putin wanting to install somebody who is favoring Russia in the leadership there in the Ukraine. Do you believe that if deals go through, that the Ukraine would be able to maintain some sense of freedom?
Well, that may be the deal that they make, that Ukraine retains its independence, it retains its government and its freedom of freedom of choice in its government, but they declare neutrality and maybe take a distance from NATO. NATO has been supplying weapons and a lot of trainers. There have been U.S. troops in Ukraine doing training along with other NATO troops, and maybe they will stop those kinds of contacts.
And we know there's a virtual NATO summit this morning. What can we expect to come out of that?
I think you'll see a couple of things. Of course, there'll be a declaration against the invasion of Ukraine, and all the NATO countries have been explicit about that. There'll probably be some short-term actions, beefing up forces in Eastern Europe. The Eastern Europeans are very nervous. In fact, they're scared to death of the Russians, given the history there. We'll see more troops, I think, going to the Baltic countries and Poland, Romania, Bulgaria. There may be some commitments to the long term, and I think that that's going to be a major effect here. The NATO countries have been increasing their defense budgets over the last couple of years. I think you're going to see a big increase there as they recognize the threat from the East.
When it comes to sanctions, and there's been a lot of talk of those over the last couple of days, when will Russia actually feel the pain from these sanctions? We know they've been beefing up their cash reserves and could probably go for a while without feeling the real pinch of this.
It's hard to say how long, but there's no question that sanctions take quite a good deal of time to take effect. I mean, we're talking months, even years before the Russians feel a severe pinch. They've been, as you note, trying to insulate themselves from sanctions because they could see that those were coming. They built up a large cash reserve, plus tried to make more of their supply chains domestic. There are some things they may still have a difficulty obtaining, chips, for example. I think they're also figuring that over the long term, the Europeans are going to need their natural gas, that the Nord Stream 2 will eventually open up. The Germans really don't have a choice. They have to get that natural gas. So I think the Russians are going to try to hang on until the sanctions weaken.
Colonel, I do want to ask you from a military strategy point there. We know that the Russians have taken over that major airfield near Kyiv, which would allow them to land military transport airplanes there. Taking a look at that, once they have control of that airfield, is that enough to say that we would be able to land a few planes, take over the capital city? Is that kind of the defying moment to say to Ukraine, there's really nowhere to go. If we start landing planes there, we'd be able to take over the capital in a matter of hours?
Yeah, it's a combination of the airport and the armored columns that are coming from the north. Apparently, they're getting close to the capital city. So the twin threats between the armored columns and the aircraft coming into the airport are, threatening the capital city. And we haven't seen in the capital city the kinds of preparations that you would expect if they were turning it into a fortress. You don't see roadblocks. You don't see fortifications along the edges of the city. The Ukrainians waited until the last minute to mobilize and take action. So the city may well be weakly defended, and that may be why the Ukrainians are willing to talk about a peace on terms that they were not willing to talk about a week ago.
Because these two countries have modern militaries, but they each have different strengths in numbers and the equipment that they have.
They do. The Russians have a very modern military, and I think it's important to recognize that this Russian military is very different from the military under the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had a very, very large military, but it was not terribly well skilled. They had a lot of conscripts on very short terms of service. The Russians look a lot like us, mostly volunteers who are there for a long time, who have a lot of training. The equipment is very good. The units are kept at a relatively high level of readiness. And interestingly, they're also very sensitive to casualties. So as I say, they look a lot like us. The Ukrainians have had built a reasonably good military. Their air force has been quite weak, though. Their navy is practically non-existent. But they do have some combat experience, having fought the Russians in the east for 8 years now. We'll see how they've been doing on the ground. I mean, so far, you get scattered reports about being able to damage Russian armored columns. On the other hand, the armored columns seem to be making progress. I think more will come out about that in the next couple of days.
Colonel, I want to ask you simply, given the airfield being taken over, given the size of Russia's army versus the size of the Ukraine's, do the Ukrainians have a choice here? Do they just have to take whatever Russia is going to be able to offer? Is there really a choice for them?
Unfortunately, it's looking like they may not, given how the Russians how well they have done and how close they are to the capital city. They may be able to take that pretty quickly now. Kiev is divided. I mean, part of it is on the east side of the river and part of it's on the west side. They may be able to hold the west side, but they're in a militarily very difficult position.
What will the world learn from this conflict? What will our military learn from what's happening?
I think there are a couple of things that will come out, and there's going to be a cottage industry about lessons learned from the conflict. One of them seems to be that armor still has a role on the modern battlefield. If the reports are accurate that Russian tank columns are approaching Kiev, even if they've taken some losses, looks like those kinds of units still have a role. There was a lot of debate about whether armor was obsolete. The air forces look like they have executed one of these standard air campaigns and seem to have been successful in suppressing the Ukrainian Air Force and air defenses. I think people are going to be looking at other things like cyber and what it's been able to do or what it's not been able to do. There are, I think, a variety of topics that people are going to investigate for probably years afterwards.
Colonel, my last one for you. I want to ask, given the show of strength by the Russian military there and how quickly they were able to get into the Ukraine, that flex of force, do you think that Vladimir Putin is done in Europe, or do you think this is just a beginning?
Well, there's no question that Putin's ambitions extend beyond Ukraine. He would like to rebuild the Soviet Union and what was for many years the Russian Empire. Whether he will be able to do that is another question. A lot depends on what comes out here in Ukraine, if Ukraine continues as an independent country. But it will make the Eastern Europeans very nervous because it shows, first, the extent of Putin's ambitions and his willingness to use force to achieve those.
Retired Marine Colonel Mark Cancian, we appreciate your expertise as Senior Advisor with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and we thank you for your service and your time this morning.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you. 9:14 now. You're watching Carolina's own Queen City News Now.
The most news in the Carolinas continues after the break.